Good afternoon, and welcome to the Delta Chamber of Commerce Virtual Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Gary Shearer. I'm the Executive Director of the Delta Chamber of Commerce, and joining me virtually is the Honorable Erin O'Toole, Leader of the Official Opposition. Today I'm broadcasting from the Delta Chamber office and would like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Tsawwassen and Musqueam First Nations, and all the Hunkaminam speaking people who have been stewards of this land since time immemorial. I'd also like to offer my respect to all the elders who have gone before us and to the elders and the First Nations people who are with us here today. We're privileged to have the following leaders logged on to the presentation today. Representing the Honorable Carla Qualtrough for Delta is Bernadette Kuzden. We have representing the City of Delta Council, Dylan Kruger. Councillor Kruger, welcome. And from the Delta Chamber Board, we have our Board Chair, Yvonne Anderson, and Directors Rob Allen and John Mancini. For the past year, the Delta Chamber of Commerce has been part of an economic recovery initiative for Delta. Delta's Community Resilience and Economic Recovery Support Team includes the City of Delta, North Delta Business Association, Ladner Business Association, the Tsawwassen Business Improvement Association, Tourism Delta, and of course, the Delta Chamber of Commerce. We have all been working together to provide support, resources, and promotional activities for our respective business communities. As part of this work, we've collaborated on the development of a We Love Delta campaign. I encourage you to visit the website at welovedelta.ca and continue to support our local businesses. During today's virtual town hall, we'll hear from leader Erin O'Toole and have the opportunity to ask questions about what his party sees on the road ahead for Canada and what the priorities need to be in order for our country to emerge successfully from the pandemic. Following our discussion, there'll be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. Events like this would not be possible without the support of our sponsors. So I would like to thank our annual sponsors, the Port of Vancouver, Global Container Terminals, Fortis BC, the City of Delta, Kwantlen Polytechnic University, and C-SPAN Ferries for their financial support of the Delta Chamber. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to the tab marked Stage to the far right of your screen. And underneath that is the Slido tab. This is where you can post questions to Leader O'Toole for the Q&A portion of this meeting. It is now my pleasure to introduce our guest, the Honorable Erin O'Toole, Leader of the Official Opposition. Erin O'Toole grew up in a General Motors family in Bowmanville, Ontario. At the age of 18, Erin joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and completed his studies at the Royal Military College. He continues his official training in Chilliwack, British Columbia, then Winnipeg, Manitoba, and settled in Halifax, Nova Scotia. As a tactical helicopter navigator, he participated in search and rescue missions off Canada's coasts, rising to the rank of captain. After 12 years of service, Erin retired from the military and returned to school to complete a law degree at Dalhousie University. Erin spent the next decade working as a lawyer in the private sector. Loyal to his brothers and sisters in arms, Erin became one of the co-founders of the True Patriot Love Foundation, a national charity serving veterans and their families. Elected 3 times in his riding of Durham, Ontario, Erin recently served as a shadow cabinet minister responsible for foreign affairs and instrumental in establishing the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. However, his proudest accomplishments remain marrying his wife, Rebecca, and being a dad to his 2 children, Molly and Jack. Elected leader of the opposition in August 2020, he is committed to standing up for all Canadians and building a stronger and more united country. Erin, welcome to the Delta Chamber of Commerce.
Gary, thank you very much for the opportunity. And it goes without saying, I wish I was with you on the ground in Delta directly. I was the leader picked amidst a pandemic, and so my travel has been limited, but I've been connecting regularly with folks in British Columbia because your economic success is so important. I ended the day with a Zoom in Langford on the island last night, and I'm so happy to be with you in Delta today. And my love for British Columbia actually began when I was 13. and I took the train with my grandfather from Toronto to Vancouver to see Expo 86.
All right.
What an incredible opportunity that was. And then, as you mentioned in the introduction, 5 years later, I was back to Chilliwack. Not exactly a vacation. I was in boot camp at the Officer Training Center at Chilliwack. And then later in my Air Force career, I did some training at Comox as well. But the true highlight of my personal experience with British Columbia was 2010, when I got to join my wife in Vancouver for over a month. She worked in the International Broadcast Center as part of the CTV Olympics team. And I was the lucky husband with tickets that got to see a lot of great events, including one of my favorite Canadian moments, seeing Alexandre Bilodeau win the first gold medal in moguls. I was there at Cyprus, sitting a few rows behind his brother. It was an incredible time. And British Columbia, you hosted the most incredible Olympic Games and made Canada proud. And, you know, the next Winter Olympics, in my view, shouldn't be in China. They should be back in your beautiful province. And we'll see if the move to relocate that games gains some steam. But I'm here to discuss in a number of ways we can support small businesses, many of your members in Delta, and talk about the overall economic recovery that our country needs. As leader of the opposition, I have a job to do to hold the Liberal government to account, and I'm glad Minister Qualtrough has some staff on this. We've been doing that, and they probably know that with COVID cases rising each day, restrictions back in place in British Columbia, Ontario under tremendous strain right now. We're all frustrated to see Canada fall well behind the US, the UK, and much of the developed world in the vaccine deployment. Canada used to be a leader. 100 years ago, we gave insulin to the world, and now we're dependent on others, and we're lagging. So Canada deserves better. We need to see the return of Canadian optimism, Canadian ingenuity, and self-sufficiency. But most of all, we need to see the return of Canadian leadership. And the very future of our country post-COVID is at stake. And we're going to see a choice whenever the next election comes, because we're at a crossroads. Which path do we want to take? The path Mr. Trudeau will talk about Monday of reimagining our economy, one that Ottawa chooses who gets ahead and who doesn't? Or do we choose a steady path to secure a strong future for more people, the path that we're promoting that will deliver those in Canada who've struggled the most through this pandemic, help them get back on their feet? Last month, I introduced Canada's recovery plan, the Conservative Party's plan to secure a future post-COVID-19. We'll enact a comprehensive jobs plan to recover the 1 million jobs lost during the pandemic within 1 year. And we won't stop there. Delta has been a vibrant and very growing city in the Lower Mainland for many years. And with that comes increased pressure on infrastructure. There's a critical need for solutions, particularly the bottleneck at the Massey Tunnel. This has serious ramifications for the community and the region. You deserve a federal partner that will work with all levels of government to meet the needs of a growing community. But for Delta to continue to thrive, you must also be able to have a safe and effective reopening of the economy. So our economic plan will take immediate action with some of the hardest hit sectors, helping those businesses and those people who have suffered the most in the pandemic, including women and young people. Our plan will rebuild the streets, the main streets of Canada, from Durham, from Scarborough to Delta, and assist small businesses to provide incentives to invest in, rebuild, and even start new businesses. And my team briefed me on the We Love Delta Christmas holiday boxes, which I thought was an incredible idea that promoted local businesses and benefited the Reach the Child and Youth Development Society. The community loved it and sold out within hours. That's leadership. That's the community. That's business leaders, nonprofit leaders, and others stepping up. You need a government who will step up and stand with you. Apart from our economic pillar, the second pillar will have the toughest accountability and transparency laws in Canadian history. We have to restore the faith of Canadians in our national institutions and in the government itself. from the Canadian Armed Forces to the Prime Minister himself, who's undergoing his third ethics investigation. There's an erosion of faith in public institutions. Third, this last year has deepened the mental health crisis Canadian communities are facing and struggling across the country. A UBC study found that 65% of respondents reported suffering pandemic-related mental wellness issues this year. That's an alarming number, and we have to have a plan to address that. And as you know, everyone, particularly in the Lower Mainland, knows, last year there were 60% more deaths from opioids than from COVID. And every life lost represents a family that is forever scarred and the promise of a life lost as well. I showed my children the faces of many of the lives lost in the opioid epidemic because so many were so young. We must, as a society, to do more. And I said to my kids when I was showing them those photos that this will be an important part of our Canada Mental Health Action Plan. We need to boost funding partnerships with the provinces and with nonprofit groups to make up ground on these mental health challenges. Our fourth pillar will ensure our country is never again unprepared for a crisis, as we have been this last year. We will make Canada more resilient, reduce our reliance on other countries, including communist China, and we will take seriously our responsibility to protect the health of Canadians, including ensuring we have domestic vaccine capacity and critical medicines capacity. Finally, our final pillar will ensure that Canada's economy is back on track by getting our budget back to balance over the next decade. Spending to protect Canadians throughout the pandemic is the right thing to do, and in opposition, the Conservatives have supported that, but we cannot pass unsustainable debt to our children and to future generations. So once the recovery starts, Conservatives will get spending under control. We will get the economy growing to secure the revenue needed to pay for the government services that Canadians depend on. This week, I was also proud to release the Conservative plan on climate change. The Liberal approach has been big government increasing a tax on consumers and unfortunately trying to phase out many jobs at a time our economy needs them the most. Our approach, which is innovative, will empower Canadians and reduce emissions while preserving jobs and economic activity across the country. In fact, we had a BC, one of the world's leading climate modeling firms, a BC firm, verify that the Conservative climate change plan will achieve the same emission reductions as Mr. Trudeau's current plan, but will grow jobs and the economy by a huge margin. So you heard that right. Our plan will match the emission reductions being promised by Mr. Trudeau without the economic disruption. And it's less cost to consumers, but just as strong impact. So I'm very excited about it. We are setting a price on carbon, but not having a national tax. BC, you've always been 10 years ahead of the rest of the country, and increasing partnerships with provinces like BC will be the way I operate as Prime Minister, not an Ottawa knows best approach. So that's an exciting example of some of the decisions that we're putting forward so that we can define a more prosperous generation for the next group of Canadians. And that's who motivates me, my young kids. I want to make sure that we leave them a Canada that is more united and more prosperous. And to do that, we need certainty, we need competent and ethical leadership, we need a recovery plan. And that's what we're putting forward to folks in Delta and across the country. So Gary, I look forward to taking the questions from your members, and thank you again for the opportunity today.
Well, thank you very much, Leader O'Toole, for that recap of your platform and the pillars that are going to take us forward. So I'd like to just very quickly come back to this climate change plan that you've just recently announced. So my understanding is the way you described it, is instead of eliminating the consumption of fossil fuels and penalizing the use of fossil fuels, what you're suggesting is that we can continue the dependency on fossil fuels, but use the carbon offsets to promote activities that are going to help climate change. Is that what I'm understanding?
Not exactly, no.
Okay.
And I'm glad you asked, Gary, because what we're doing is similar only in one respect. We're putting a price on carbon for consumers. So when they consume hydrocarbons, but we're not taxing it. We're putting that price, and that price will then be transferred into a low carbon savings account that the Canadian family or small business can then use their money in their account for purchases that are related to reducing their carbon footprint. In fact, we're trusting Canadians here. Canadians will see exactly what their carbon footprint is now because their account will reflect that. The price will be considerably less, more than 70% less for consumers than Mr. Trudeau's ever increasing carbon tax, because we're doing more on industrial emissions, EVs, and a range of other things. So we're putting less burden on the family, the small business owner, the commuter. But when I heard yesterday the Liberals suggesting that was encouraging people to go out and add to their low carbon savings account, it's their money. So whether it'd be similar to you transferring money between your checking and your savings account, it's your money. So I don't think people are going to be going out and driving around a little extra in the car. It's actually going to be an exact representation of what their carbon footprint is now, but then that savings account will be applied towards lowering it, maybe with more efficient furnace or with decisions related to the home. I think Canadians don't want billions sent into the black hole of Ottawa where they don't have any accountability on where it goes, how much their actual contribution was. This actually puts people in the driver's seat and lets us all own our role in reducing emissions. It's innovative, and that's maybe why the government yesterday was caught off guard. They just know how to tax people and have Ottawa create solutions. This is letting every single Canadian be part of the solution.
Okay. All right, thank you for that. You were kind enough to mention the George Massey Tunnel, something that we've been living with here south of the Fraser for too many years. And so, Leader O'Toole, tell us how, because this is really provincial jurisdiction as far as the replacement of the tunnel. Could you just, tell us how your party would help move that replacement forward?
Sure, and great example of the need for partnerships, because many of these key infrastructure projects will have a municipal lead, but will require provincial and federal participation. If you're talking about a bridge or a long-term major regional piece of transport infrastructure, the municipality doesn't have the tax base to do that themselves, no question. So you have to have the province, you have to have the federal government. Mr. Trudeau is behind in two respects. One, he always has an Ottawa knows best approach. And, their budget on Monday, they want to reimagine the Canadian economy. I doubt they've called Delta Council. I doubt they've called Dylan and others to ask what their priorities are, because Ottawa thinks they know best with Mr. Trudeau. The other area that they've been really, really lagging on is they've only spent to date about half of what their announced infrastructure spending is. So they have 40% of the dollars they've said they're putting forward for infrastructure lapsing, not being spent, meaning going back into general accounts. The estimates they're promising aren't being spent. And I think a lot of Canadians would remember the success the Conservative government had in 2009 after the global recession. The reason why we're the only country a few years later to have a balanced budget, we spent on infrastructure and we got money out the door at the most effective rate ever in Canadian history. And how could we do that? We had to partner with municipal, with provincial, and in some cases institutions like universities and others for shovel-ready top priority projects. So that's going to be our approach. What is the top priority in this region to make sure that there are solutions? And where can the federal government be a partner, not a top-down preacher? So I think that will be the very big difference. And in my private sector experience, you know, I know you build strong teams, but then you also have accountability metrics to make sure you're getting the dollars out the door.
Okay. Well, you mentioned Councillor Kruger, and I see that Councillor Kruger has a question which has been promoted by a number of participants with regards to housing. You and I were talking just prior to the going live about the cost of housing and how our family home that my mother still lives in back in Scarborough that we moved to in 1963 is worth a little bit more today. Yeah, the question is, you know, housing crisis has resulted, particularly in Delta, a lot of families leaving Delta, including our children who have moved to other communities looking for affordable housing. What policies will your party propose to facilitate a larger housing supply, affordable housing supply in Canada's urban centers?
Great question, and I appreciate it. In some of my outreach, I have been in touch with Councillor Kruger to get perspective. I spoke to the mayor of Langford a few weeks ago. I'm always, because I can't travel and have coffees and lunches, I do Zooms and calls to get the input of people on the ground, hear the priorities. Housing is so critical in the Lower Mainland that I've created, for the first time for our party, a shadow minister for housing. He's a great MP from Mission, Massey, Fraser Canyon, so not far away. And he is coming up with a series of policies for us to address this crunch. This is another example where there are roles for all levels of government. Certainly supply, where that can be part of the solution, has to be part of the solution. Some decisions about density and development, which are more municipal, that has to be part of the solution. But federally, both from a mortgage, a CMHC, and the first-time homebuyers incentives and policies are part of it. But we're also going to have policies with respect to affordable housing and people at risk. Part of our mental health and wellness strategy will address some of the folks at risk in that transitional piece where affordable housing is not there, people have issues, and then the worst case scenario, they become homeless. So housing has a whole spectrum, right? From how can we get young people like our kids into a home in the GVR or the Lower Mainland or the GTHA. We're going to be looking at a number of federal ways that we can provide that assistance. And I applaud some of the moves started with British Columbia on the foreign ownership piece. That has hit the Lower Mainland in a major way. We need to work on that, including some of the money laundering work as well federally, because that money has also exacerbated the issue. So this is another area we're going to be presenting a fairly detailed policy platform on this ahead of an election that will come sometime in the next year. And the input from MP Brad Viss, our Conservative member from the Lower Mainland, will be key.
Terrific, thank you. So next question we have here regarding proportional representation. This has been debated for a number of years as to how we overhaul our electoral system to have better representation in our voting process. What are your thoughts on proportional representation, such as mixed member proportional or rural-urban proportional representation?
There have been many debates on this. In fact, there's been referendums in your province and in my province. They've been defeated. And personally, Gary, I think for good reason. You know, the two constants are death and taxes, right? People complain about politics and government, and that's understandable. Particularly when we see Canada so far behind in vaccines, you hear people are frustrated. But do we change our fundamental parliamentary democracy? I don't think we do, because I'll tell you, it will only exacerbate regional and other tensions in our country, because once you allow a certain threshold to gain official party status and be there forever, we would have more separation parties. We would have parties that would be single issue parties. Complain about the main parties as much as people do, and you might like, but they are brokerage parties, especially our party. We have a cross section of Canadians that come together and then try and set some priorities. I'm growing our party and I'm reaching out and modernizing and bringing in some new folks. But we are a brokerage. We respect one another and we're not driving single issue. And if you look, Israel and other countries that have multiple elections every few months because they have to wage these sort of political games behind closed doors on proportional representation. I don't think it's a positive. But here's something I have been thinking about and talking about a little bit is Australia has mandatory voting. The courts have recently said Canadian citizens living abroad can vote. In the past, they weren't able to because part of where you voted was the riding you lived in. You had to be 18, you had to be a citizen, and you had to have a riding, right? You had to live in Delta or in Durham. Now that people can live in Hong Kong or Europe and vote, shouldn't we be following the lead of one of our sort of peer parliamentary democracies like Australia and thinking that basic element of citizenship is voting? Even if you mark none of the above, quite frankly, I think that's a civic duty that we should encourage. And I think I'm going to look closely at what Australia's been doing. I think there's a lot of things we can do to bring confidence. The second pillar of my recovery plan, Gary, is I want to overhaul transparency and accountability federally because people lose faith in their institutions if they think there's one rule for MPs and cabinet ministers or the prime minister who's on his third personal ethics violation. The $1 billion island getaway, there was no consequences. There was then the SNC-Lavalin violation of the law, no consequences. And now the WE scandal. There should be consequences for serious violations of the public trust. There should be serious consequences for sexual military conduct investigations. And so part of our transparency and accountability initiative will try and show that, hey, you're frustrated with our system. Let's not throw out our parliamentary democracy. Let's push for better.
Okay. So another question that seems to be very popular, Leader O'Toole, as you know, we are a port city here in Delta. And we have a very large container port and coal port facility at Roberts Bank. The Port of Vancouver and as well as one of the terminal operators are proposing expansion of that port. Could you tell us what your party's view is on port expansion, specifically in Delta, and what your position would be in supporting that expansion with the issues around environment and the eco-sensitive areas around the port?
Yeah, this is an issue, thank you, that's been brought to my attention before as well. The Port of Delta is an important part of our Asia Pacific strategy. There were infrastructure dollars that went in when we were in government. I'll use an example. Trade with India, when the Conservatives were in, went up by literally 100%. It's barely matched inflation in recent years. We need to grow new markets in the Indo-Pacific and in the Pacific more broadly, because we are going to see more continued uncertainty and disruption with China, given the actions of the communist leadership there, with our citizens, with trade disruptions, with the genocide of the Uyghurs and the Hong Kong situation. So we need to diversify our Pacific gateway strategies. And the Delta Port is an important part of that. And here's, again, another area of federal partnership. Ports have that federal component and have the multiplier effect for the entire national economy. So there's jobs for families in Delta. There's also reaching export markets that benefits families far from Delta. So that national interest that is there for a critical piece of trade infrastructure like a port, I believe means that the federal government has a meaningful role to be a partner on having the most world-class environmental and wildlife mitigation strategies as possible. And the environment is very important to me, as people saw yesterday from our announcement. Probably the most substantive environmental policy document ever released by a Canadian politician was yesterday. Modeled, when Mr. Trudeau first ran in 2015, he said he was leaving carbon pricing to the provinces and had a couple of paragraphs. I had a modeled, smart, multi-year plan. Needs to be the same thing here. I think we can, wherever possible, mitigate concerns with respect to environmental and ecological impact of an expansion. And we cannot be satisfied with the way things were done in the past, because we know that when the port was opened, and certainly in the past, there was not a degree of consideration for the environment, for nearby residents, or for wildlife. I think we have to strive to have the best policies in the world, but we also have to say these pieces of economic infrastructure are critical to our country's prosperity. And this is why federally, I want to be a partner so that we can leverage those foreign markets, but make sure that we do it to the highest standards in the world.
Great, thank you. You had mentioned in your opening comments about our dependencies on other countries, and that certainly has come to light with regards to our vaccination program and getting access to the very critical vaccines that we need to deploy for COVID-19. Leader O'Toole, could you tell us what specifically actions would you take to ensure Canada's security with regards to having access to this technology and being able to develop these vaccines here in Canada for the future?
It's a matter of political will and leadership, and that's been lacking entirely from the beginning of this crisis. And I say that with regret, because I suspended my leadership campaign. I even offered to sit in a joint cabinet at the beginning of the crisis. I joined the military because I'll always put the country first, and that hasn't changed as a parliamentarian. And I've been so disappointed to see us 2 or 3 steps behind our allies all the time. I was calling for self-sufficiency on everything from rapid tests to vaccines last spring, and countries that showed that will, like the United Kingdom, actually were behind us in capacity for a major run of vaccines for COVID-19, but with the dedication of funding and initiative, caught up and surpassed. And now we're seeing countries like that largely avoid a third wave. We're getting slammed by a third wave and the risks of variants because we have very low vaccination rates and we had no national plan for it. So I will not permit that to happen. And this is about accountability. And it's about having a leader that sets the tone of Canada being ready and prepared. Our pillar, the 4th pillar of our recovery plan, is this capacity building piece. When I hear the government suggest that Canada did not have the capacity, or when they bring up this total fraudulent argument that the Mulroney government somehow privatized the Connaught Labs, that is all completely misleading. Canada had capacity both in Montreal, Quebec City area, the Toronto area, and even in Vancouver. And in fact, even Abcelera's medical component to treat and mitigate serious disease state COVID with seniors has largely been unused because the federal government sat on pursuing a strategy to leverage that great BC developed innovation. The federal government needed to provide supply of these critical medicines and set the framework up for a national series of rapid testing and screening. The government did not do that. In fact, they blocked it by blocking approvals and not deploying the funding needed. So I will make sure that we have that capacity. We've also announced that we will have immediate inquiry into our response so that we can learn lessons learned. I've even asked the government to appoint a special monitor of the Auditor General right now so that we can monitor in real time areas that we could possibly fix even before the inquiry. This is what businesses would do. This is what the military and other organizations, including aid groups, do. It's been sad to see the federal government doesn't have this continuous improvement, lessons learned approach themselves.
Leader O'Toole, the next question, there's a lot of small business representatives on this call today, and I know there's been a lot of money spent, as we know, much needed, agreed to support our economy during this pandemic. But there's a fear that there's a bill coming, and that bill is going to rest solidly on the shoulders of small business. And it's going to create real challenges in the years to come for the small business to thrive with the burden of significant taxes. Could you tell us how your government will ensure that there is not going to be additional taxes placed on small businesses when we come out the other end of this pandemic?
Thank you, Gary. Yes, in fact, my announcement yesterday, our creation of the low carbon savings account actually helps small business who have no rebating, even a portion up to a certain amount under the federal Trudeau carbon tax. Now, it doesn't affect all provinces, but we need to stop piling on more and more tax and regulation on the SME, the small and medium-sized enterprise space. They don't have armies of accountants and lawyers and regulatory advisors. The more complex and the more burdensome the tax load, the smaller the margins are for largely the families that are behind, or maybe in some cases a couple of families who give 24/7 to the running of that job and often are employing the mom or dad from several other families. So the well-being of the small and medium-sized business sector is critical. 2/3 of Canadians work within that sphere. And so we need a plan for Main Street. We also need a plan for critically impacted sectors like hospitality and tourism. I spoke to the Vancouver Island Tourism Association last night. Complaints about slow and uncertain approach on the rent assistance programs. The tenants were left out. It was to the big landlords, another Ottawa knows best approach that forgot the needs. So when I said we supported the government throughout the crisis, we did. We approved programs like the wage subsidy when it was 10%. We approved it, got the money out of the door, and asked the government to change it to 75. We approved the rent subsidy to get the money out the door, and then said, this can't be so complex. We approved the CEBA, the business account loan, and then made it more expansive and took on the unique impacts to newly created businesses afterwards. And in fairness, in some cases, the government listened quickly, like on the wage subsidy. The rent subsidy piece, it took months for us to make some of the changes. And that's what frustrates people, the slow responsiveness of government to companies that are burning through their retained earnings by the minute. And remember, those same retained earnings, Mr. Trudeau tried to go after a few years ago with the small business tax changes. So we're going to have an entire set of packages to address these issues. And when I had my call with the Prime Minister at the beginning of the week about the budget for Monday, this was what I asked. I want to see a plan for jobs. I want to see a plan for small business. I don't want grandiose reimagining schemes. Let's focus on the foundations of our economies, whether in Delta or in Durham. If we see a raft of insolvencies from small business, we see unemployment, we see families hurt, we see empty storefronts on main streets. Let's save those businesses so they can thrive when the economy recovers.
Okay, thank you. Another question that, again, being a Delta, we have the Fraser River and we have the oceans right on our doorstep, and flood protection being a significant concern. And particularly with the 65 kilometers of dikes that we have in this community that are in bad need of upgrades. And we've been told that the cost of these upgrades, including the seismic modifications that would be required, get into the billions of dollars. Can you tell us what your government's position would be in supporting any flood-related community like Delta in addressing the sea level rises and flood issues that climate change brings?
An important question, and the Fraser is a real jewel and a resource for our country. And as my colleague Mark Strahl likes to remind people in Ottawa all the time, one of the busiest rivers, if not the busiest in the country. And a lot of people would assume that would be the St. Lawrence and some others. So the infrastructure and flood mitigation risks, especially in Delta, as you said in its name, is real. So yesterday, not widely reported, Gary, but a key component of my climate change plan with serious money committed to it was resiliency and capacity. Now, some of that is recognizing that climate change is already having an impact on our environment and our critical infrastructure. You can't point to one storm or one season, but you're seeing the need for more resiliency because over time, you're going to see more flood occurrence, higher incidences of century storms, these sorts of things. So we have to batten down the hatches, sort of to use a nautical theme. And that means the resiliency piece for critical infrastructure, we are going to dedicate a national infrastructure fund for to build this capacity. So this is another example where we would look to partner the federal government, particularly when it comes to key navigation ports and oceans. We have a direct area of jurisdiction, but a need to require partnership with municipal and provincial levels of government. So if one thing I think your members are getting a sense from me as a new leader, I build partnerships. I hold myself to a high standard of accountability and planning, but I also want to make sure that we respect the priorities of people on the ground. And this will be an example of that, because I think all provinces have some areas that are acutely at risk to higher incident flooding, and this is what this fund is meant to address.
Terrific. All right, we're getting close to time here, Leader O'Toole. So we have a chance for one last question here. So here it goes. How would an O'Toole government win back voters that identify as fiscal conservatives, but are also very concerned about the historical stance of the Conservatives Party on social issues?
A good question to end with, Gary, because this is something I've said from the first moment I was elected, which at the end of August, I gave a speech at 1:30 in the morning, Ontario time, to a largely empty room because of COVID. But I said, regardless of your background, whether you're an Indigenous Canadian, you've been here 3 months or 3 generations, whether you're LGBTQ or straight, if you worship Friday, Saturday, Sunday, every day, or not at all, you have an important role in our party. And my record is very clear. I stand up for the rights of all Canadians, much like I say I did in uniform, standing up for our rights and our institutions in our country. I do the same thing in Parliament. And I've always stood up for women's rights, LGBTQ community, and I want to see our party reflect the Canada of 2021. So I'm proud we're having people with Indigenous backgrounds stepping up to run for us, cultural communities, more women, members of the LGBTQ community. My colleague from Ontario just has been a big champion on ending the discriminatory blood ban against gay men. He just put out a very powerful video this week on it. So people will look at the Conservative Party and say, you have the chance for a competent and ethical government with a leader who's been reaching out and growing our tent to get our country moving and make sure we lead the world in economic recovery from COVID. We don't continue to lag it like we have recently. So I'll leave it for people to judge themselves on whether we've addressed those issues, but I'm in politics to fight for the rights of people. A right of a Canadian will never be removed under an O'Toole government. I will defend them and make sure I fight for their prosperity in an uncertain time post-COVID. So that's my focus, and I hope people get to hear that message.
Well, thank you again, Leader O'Toole, for your time today. Any parting messages for our audience?
Well, I just want to wish everyone in Delta well. I'll end as I started. I wish I was able to be there with you. Obviously, these are very challenging times, and BC is in new restrictions after many months of not having some of the ones that we've seen in Ontario and Quebec. But we will follow these public health guidance. We will get our vaccines. We will get through this. We're frustrated. We're slower than other countries. But I'm an optimist, Gary, so I'm an opposition leader, so I sound like I'm opposing all the time. I'm now proposing ideas on the environment, on the economy, because I truly think Canada's the greatest country and our best days are ahead of us. So I want to send that message of hope and best wishes of health to all your members, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Leader O'Toole. And yes, once all this is over and we do get to physically visit with each other, you are most welcome to visit us here at the Delta Chamber of Commerce.
I look forward.
This now ends our question and answer period. Again, I would like to thank our annual sponsors, the Port of Vancouver, Global Container Terminals, Fortis BC, the City of Delta, Kwantlen Polytechnic University, and Seaspan Ferries for your commitment to supporting our chamber network and allowing us to put on events like this today. As we conclude today's program, again, thank you, Leader O'Toole, for taking the time to address our business community. And thank you, everyone, for being with us here today. We hope that you enjoyed the format, and we look forward to seeing everybody again next Thursday, April 22nd, when we have our 111th AGM at the Delta Chamber of Commerce. Everyone be safe and have a great day.